Hi, everybody. I am Diane Brady. I'm here with Gordon Chang, author, geopolitical expert, senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. Gordon, I follow you on X at Gordon G. Chang. I always feel I should mention that. I love talking to you about China, and we're looking at the year that was and the year ahead. Let's just start with what do you think the current state of U.S. China relations is, especially following the recent meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping?
Well, Nicholas Burns, our ambassador in Beijing, put it best a couple days ago when he said he's not optimistic about future relations between Beijing and Washington. And that, I think, really sums up the meeting on November 15th between President Biden and Xi Jinping. President Biden touted a lot of progress, but there was no joint press conference, which was not a good sign. And there also wasn't a good sign that there was no joint statement. So again, I think we have an American leader saying that things are rosy when the external signs are saying they're not. So I don't see that relations are going to get better. And this is not because of anything on our side. I think it's just internally in China. They're going to push Xi Jinping in directions that we don't want him to go.
Now, when you say they're going to push President Xi in directions that we don't want them to go, who is doing the pushing? Because I've always thought of him as being very much the person in charge and the person who's setting the direction of Chinese policy.
Well, he has been in charge. Although in 2023, we saw a number of things that say extreme political turmoil at the top of the Communist Party, both in the civilian and in the military ranks. So we have to assume that there's a lot of infighting, which means that Xi Jinping may not be as strong as he appears. And I think that essentially we're seeing inside the party a lot of incentives pushing Xi Jinping in the wrong directions. So, for instance, he's accumulated a lot of power over his time at the top of the Communist Party. He took a consensual political system in 2012 when he was elevated to General Party Secretary, and he took power from everybody else, which means that he has accountability, and that means he knows that he's at risk, especially since during his time, he has increased the cost of losing political struggles. So you put those two things together, more risk because of increasing the cost of losing, plus total accountability. And now I think that he is under assault from other party leaders. So this is not a good recipe. And it means that China is probably going to be more belligerent and provocative over 2024.
Well, and let's not forget, he had an unprecedented extra term, which I think made people feel that in some ways he was in essence a dictator. So that's not the case. It's still very much the party apparatus that is directing the policy.
Yeah. President Biden on 2 occasions now has called him a dictator. And I think that that's right, because he is the one man in what is now a one-man system. And, we got to remember that there are very few coincidences when it comes to Communist Party politics, but a lot of this turbulence started when Xi Jinping started his 3rd term as General Secretary, a term that basically nobody else in Beijing wanted him to have. So, the changes that he has wrought in the political system, I think lead to instability. Things would be okay if Xi Jinping were unchallenged and then he could do what he wanted, but that's not the Beijing that we see right now. We can't say exactly what's happening, Diane, because the system has become less transparent in China. But we do know we're seeing things that do not happen unless there is extreme turbulence.
I want to talk a little bit about motivation, because if you step back to the 30,000-foot view, the geopolitical landscape right now is very volatile. You've got Ukraine, you've got the Israel-Hamas war. It would seem that both China and the U.S. as major powers would want a stable relationship. Maybe not the friendliest of relationships, maybe not the most open, but they would seem to have, in some ways, overlapping interests with regard to at least keeping that particular link stable. You don't think that's the case?
Well, that should be the case. And that's what we want to be the case. But we got to remember that China greenlighted Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We can see that from their 5,300 word joint statement declaring their no limits partnership just 20 days before Russia invaded Ukraine. We know that China's been fully supporting the Russian war effort. We know that China's been fully supporting Iran's war effort against Israel with the elevated commodity purchases. Just to give you some example of how important this is, in the first 9 months of 2023, China's purchases of Iranian oil was 60% above that in 2017. And 2017 is important because that was the last year before the Trump administration reimposed sanctions on the purchase of Iranian oil. And we know that the Chinese diplomats have been providing cover for Hamas. So China is destabilizing the Middle East. And also, if that weren't bad enough, China and Russia have been fueling insurgencies in North Africa that look like wars. So China's been an arsonist. And, I totally agree with you. It's in China's interest to have a stable world. But unfortunately, China is the one that is destabilizing the international system right now.
Let's talk some specifics about the business landscape. Two complex economies, both are in some ways an arms race over AI and other innovations. Let's start with kind of the links, the trade links, the fact that supply chains, while perhaps less dependent on China, are very much still placed in that country, in the region. What is the status of that in your mind in terms of both what's happening today and what you would advise business leaders for tomorrow?
Well, trade between the United States and China is declining. And we know this from the U.S. Department of Commerce figures for the first 10 months of this year, where merchandise trade between China and the United States was down 19 point, I think it was 3 or 8%. So almost 20% year on year. And I think that tells us a lot about the trade patterns. Investment patterns, we are seeing two things happen. First of all, there's the Biden administration gets great credit for imposing curbs on sensitive technologies being transferred to China. It's not doing enough, but it's made some important advances. And second of all, Xi Jinping has been pushing foreign business out of China. So, for instance, we have seen in the third quarter of 2023 a net disinvestment from China by foreign investors. The first time this has happened since records been kept since 1998. And that trend is only going to accelerate because Xi Jinping is making sure that the Chinese market is reserved for Chinese entities. So I think the message to business is certainly going to be your time in China is limited. And that specifically is true of a company called Apple. We are seeing the Chinese government and the party go after Apple relentlessly. Most recently with these bans on bringing Apple products into the office, which is basically a reimposition of rules, which are quite some time, but they're putting more effort into enforcement. They're really getting behind Huawei. And the message to a company like Apple is, you have no long-term future in China as long as Xi Jinping is around. And I don't think the equity markets have understood that yet. But what's true with Apple is true with a lot of other companies as well. There is just no future in China along this current trajectory.
When you say the equity markets, are you talking about investors in Apple, or are you talking about investors in China funds? In what respect should the equity markets catch up to reality?
Yeah, on that specific statement, I was referring to investors in Apple. I don't think that they understand Apple's problems in China, the severity of them, and that Apple basically can't do anything about it. Because as long as Xi Jinping's there, Apple is a goner, I think. But when you start to look at investment in China, just the 30,000 picture, as you put it, Xi Jinping really wants to make sure that Chinese companies take advantage of the Chinese market. And he's basically really referring to state enterprises. So even privately owned companies like Alibaba and Tencent, which are really good companies, I think have a really hard time looking forward. But got to remember, and if you're going to go up to that high level again, remember the Chinese economy is really distressed right now for a number of reasons. It's not growing at the 5.2% pace that they claimed for the first 3 quarters of this year. We don't know how fast it's growing, if it's growing at all, but you can make a case for anything from -1 to +1. But I don't think you can make a case for much more. Even though 2022 was a really bad year, there's a lot of really bad signs for the current period right now.
Given that stress, it would seem that there is more pressure for some political wins. I'm thinking of Taiwan. I'm thinking of some of what we've seen in, just in general around that region with regard to political activity. Obviously, you and I spoke earlier this year about the spy balloon. We've heard about digital espionage. What is that? What's happening on that front? And both the pressure on Xi, but also I think what we should be looking out for in terms of some of the political risks for China.
Well, for Taiwan, at this moment, I think that the Chinese military is merely huffing and puffing because they got the January 13th national elections for president and for the national legislature. So China's only going to do a lot of bluffing. After that, I actually sort of become much more optimistic about peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait because the Chinese military is, with all the purges of senior officers, I don't think that the Chinese military believes that it can undertake a coordinated air, land, sea invasion of Taiwan and take on not only Taiwan, but Japan and the United States. So I sort of see in the foreseeable future, basically no attempt to seize Taiwan. But I am really, really distressed about what's occurring daily in the Philippines at Second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, and Whitsun Reef, where Beijing has been engaging in really belligerent activities. And they've been doing that despite written and oral warnings from the United States that we are prepared to use force to discharge our obligations under our 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty with Manila. And so that's a very dangerous area. I think China could blunder into clearly a downward spiral of events. So, with China just boiling over, and we don't know, as I said, exactly what's going on, but, we have to be prepared for worst outcomes in places like in the South China Sea, among others.
So we're heading into an election year here in the U.S. We have seen how, let's say, Trump and Biden, we don't know if those will be the two final candidates, but of course that's looking to be the case. How would you compare them in terms of their engagement, their rhetoric, and their relationship with Beijing?
Well, President Biden, if he's the nominee, I think he's going to try to just maintain sort of quiet with regard to China between now and November, so that he doesn't have to talk about the issue. I think that he'd prefer not to discuss it, except to say that he's, quote unquote, stabilized relations. Trump on the campaign trail hasn't said very much about China. And I think that he, again, doesn't want to really talk about the issue. But China can make itself a campaign issue, which is unavoidable. And it's probably going to try and test our system in the run-up to the November elections.
Test
China,
through cyber attacks? What do you mean test?
First of all, they're going to get very involved in trying to influence outcomes of not only the presidential but other races, like they did in 2020, where they put the thumb on the scale in both the primaries and in the general election. But also, I think that they are just going to generally continue to do what they have done, and that is to try to sow discord. So they'll be involved in that. Also, just in general, going to the other things, that China is just in a point where I don't think it can maintain good relations with the U.S. for a number of reasons, which means that, it's not going to be able to help itself between now and November, which means that it will become an issue that Biden and Trump, if they're the nominees, will have to deal with. So, you know, I tend to think the two candidates will want to fight it out on other issues, but nonetheless, China will force them to talk about relations with that country.
It is hard, if not impossible, to talk about relations with China, which is why I always welcome the chance to talk about it with you. Gordon, thank you so much for joining us, and Happy New Year. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, Happy New Year to you, Diane, and stay safe.
Thank you.